Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2026 dialogue session of the International Journal of Islamic Architecture. My name is Deniz Avcı, and I am an associate professor of architectural history at Izmir University of Economics in Turkey. I serve as assistant editor with the journal, and it's my pleasure to host the annual iteration of dialogues on the topic healthcare architecture in Islamic traditions and translations. I would like to warmly welcome all of you and the three exceptionally talented scholars with whom we are fortunate to speak today: Cansu Değirmencioğlu, Sarah Honormand Ebrahimi, and Kamyar Salavati. Before we start, I would like to add a brief note. We are deeply concerned and profoundly affected by what is happening in the world and in the region. And as a researcher who studies spaces of care and healing, war feels not only devastating but beyond comprehension. So I would like to thank all panelists for being here despite these circumstances. The International Journal of Islamic Architecture has been publishing rigorous peer-reviewed scholarship since 2012 with the Intellect Press, and IJIA focuses on the urban design, architecture, and landscape architecture of both the historic Islamic world and the more recent global geographies of Islam. Our emphasis is on detailed analysis of the historical, theoretical, and practical aspects of architecture, examining not only buildings themselves, but also the social dynamics and lived experiences that shape the built environment. If you're interested in contributing your research, please visit our website for submission information. The Dialogue series is the IJIA's annual roundtable in which we bring together scholars and practitioners from varied disciplines for a discussion of critical contemporary issues that explore the boundaries between architecture, art, anthropology, archaeology, geography, sociology, and history. You can find the recordings of the dialogue series on the IJIA YouTube channel, and the edited discussions appear in the first issue of the journal each year. My interest in healthcare architecture deepened significantly with the COVID-19 pandemic and expanded through co-coordinating two nationally awarded projects on Turkish sanatoria. In my research, I witnessed how architecture, design, and health are in constant interaction, and with the bacteriological age, architecture's impact on infectious diseases became critically understood, and sickness itself shaped societies, communities, and individual identities. Healthcare modernization and hygienic design principles emerged in response to the knowledge of the bacteriological era. Simplified ornament-free design, concrete, steel, and glass construction, and spaces opening to light, fresh air, and nature characterized this era. Cities became critical sites where disease control intersected with modernization agendas. Urban interventions, from segregated hospital districts to defining and building new housing zones to sanitation infrastructure, reflected not only medical knowledge but political power dynamics and social hierarchies. Most recent research offers a new perspective and reveals that emotions and senses in healthcare architecture mediate between clinical sterility and human needs. Patients experience treatment spaces differently through heightened bodily awareness, creating intensified spatial memories that profoundly shape their capacity to endure and heal. In the context of Islamic traditions, there have been architectural and design approaches suited to geography, period, and cultural practices that have continued for centuries. These approaches display an interesting and rich variety, from public spaces like caravanserais to healing spaces like bimaristans to the region-specific authentic characteristics of vernacular and traditional residential architecture. Our discussion examines the bacteriological era's negotiations between health modernization, whether imposed by colonial powers or adopted by newly independent Islamic states, and sociocultural and religious norms. We ask which architectural and urban elements were transformed, which disappeared, which persisted, and which were reinterpreted through translation in Islamic contexts. We hope our discussions will open new perspectives on designing for the future for the Islamic societies. In this visual literature review, if you will, there are many examples I had to omit and could not fit here, so I apologize in advance to scholars who have produced excellent work on important sources I have missed. So without prolonging further, I would like to introduce our brilliant guests and begin our conversation. Cansu Cansu Değirmencioğlu is an architectural historian based in Berlin. Her work explores the intersections of architecture, health, and cultural production in the 20th century with a focus on hygiene, childhood, and public health in early Republican Turkey. She completed her doctorate at the Technical University of Munich, and her recent work includes projects related to sanatoria, domestic space, rural health campaigns, and the visual culture of modern medicine. Sara Honormand Ebrahimi is an architectural historian of health, emotions, and the body. She is a British Academy International Fellow at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, the University of Exeter, working on her project Building for Holistic Healthcare, a Global Health Story from Within, 1860s to 1970s. Her first monograph, Emotion, Mission, Architecture, won the Persian Heritage Foundation and Association for the Study of Persianate Societies Book Award in the History of Art and Architecture and earned an honorable mention for the IJIA 2025 Book Award. Kamyar Salavati is an architectural theorist, musicologist, and PhD candidate at the University of Exeter. His doctoral research examines how epidemics shaped modern architecture and urbanism in Iran from 1850s to 1950s. His publications include the forthcoming The Architecture of Intoxication, Opium Dens, Use of Bodies, and New World Orders, and Music of the Deprived Lower Bodies, Medicalization, Modernization, and the Reformation of Iranian Classical Music. These three scholars bring expertise spanning Turkey, Iran, and broader Islamic geographies, examining how patients, practitioners, and communities negotiated healthcare modernization. So, without further ado, I would like to continue with the questions and start our conversation. Our discussion is organized around 6 thematic clusters, and I will pose each set of questions to the group, and we will move through them conversationally. So the first cluster centers on traditions and translation. This is a nod to our dialogue theme. I am interested in two things. First, how did colonial powers or modernizing states use health and hygiene discourses to frame Islamic built environments and justify architectural interventions? And then, when important design principles and healthcare standards arrived in Islamic contexts, how were they negotiated and reinterpreted? And what new building typologies came out of that encounter? Sarah, would you like to start us off?
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Dennis, for the invitation and for preparing everything. To answer the question, I think firstly, it's important to consider we are talking about which colonial context and which colonial power. But more broadly speaking, medicine only began to be considered or to be used as a tool of empire building really in the mid-19th century. Prior to the mid-19th century, medicine has not really reached the stage to be considered effective as a tool of empire building. My focus has previously primarily been on missionary medicine, and Islamic built environment is really not a concern or not a topic of conversation in missionary records. They experienced opposition, and they had to really think and be strategic and about where they are going to build the hospitals and how they are going to build them. In certain locations and cities, they made the decision to build smaller hospitals or incorporate local ways of construction in order to attract the patients, or in order so that for the hospitals to not stand out as a threat, the term that they use it. Their concern was with how people are going to perceive the hospitals. And because of this, they even invented new types of hospital planning. The architecture of these hospitals, it's difficult to understand the architecture of these hospitals in medical terms or in architectural terms. Important was missionaries' understanding of perception, or missionaries' understanding of how people in certain locations relate to their surroundings. So here, medicine was really a secondary tool. It was an important tool, but it was not like missionary thinking of medicine is effective. We are going to build hospitals and patients are going to come to the hospitals and we are going to have a great time. But they had to really be strategic how they are going to approach it.
Thank you, Sarah. Cansu, how does this resonate with your work on the Turkish case?
Yes, thank you, Deniz, and thank you for the invitation again. Thank you for the question. So I'm approaching this from the lens of a modernizing state rather than a colonizing power. My focus is early Turkish Republic from 1920s to 1950s. So the Republic of Turkey was formed immediately after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And while this was not a colonial or post-colonial context, there are still striking parallels in how nation-building discourse in the early decades used this themes to justify interventions and reshape perceptions of the built environment. So I think this is like a common point with Sarah. So in my research, I found that early Republican states relied heavily on binaries like old versus new in the propaganda of the reforms. And in this process, the Ottoman past was often pathologized in many ways, and traditional architecture was not only described as old or outdated, but sometimes literally framed as sick, decades, life-threatening. So if you could argue that a built environment was a breeding ground for germs, then you have had a scientific mandate to replace it with something new and modern. So, but what is interesting is that this discourse was not necessarily targeting something rigidly defined as Islamic architecture. It was much more about distancing the new things from the Ottoman past, the Ottoman identity. So at the same time, the relationship between Islamic built environments and modern healthcare in Turkey. So for that sense, it's very complex. The Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, and many processes of modernization, including medical reforms, had already begun in the late 19th century. So when the Republic emerged, it certainly dismantled the institutional authority of Islam, but it was also operating within a largely Muslim social fabric, which was something new in a way, especially after the collapse of the empire and the population exchanges. This required a kind of careful balance, and secularization was not necessarily enacted through dramatic architectural hostile gestures. You don't really see gestures like tearing down mosques and building bacteriology laboratories in their place. But instead, what changed was the narrative framework through which health and disease itself was understood and framed. So sickness was increasingly framed not as a God-given divine fate, but as a preventable scientific condition within the secularizing context. And this allowed for strategic interpretations of existing spaces. Some building types could be reframed as compatible with modern hygiene, while others were discredited. For example, hammams could remain because they could easily be framed as hygienic spaces. But I know some of them were renovated anyways, but madrasas, the religious teaching institutions, were often described so they were closed down. And in newspapers and official texts, they were described as cobwebbed, spiderwebbed, gloomy, dusty, moldy, disease-giving places. So images both literally corrupting the body and metaphorically suffocating the national body. You see these narratives all entangled like architectural space and disease and the past. Modern hospitals had already begun replacing Darüşşafaka and traditional health institutions in the late Ottoman period, so there wasn't a really rupture there. So modern healthcare institutions didn't just start with the Republic, of course, but it inherited like a existing building stock. Some could be still keep their original functions, some needed new functions, some were in a torn down state. And health argument and health context was an important parameter in all these like transformation processes. So what I see is this change of this understanding of health, not like the buildings itself, not a dramatic change, but there is a transformation process, and health was both a metaphor and both like a, I don't know, target, goal, function, everything there.
Thank you very much, Cansu. Kamyar, can you bring in the Iranian perspective here, or would you like to add anything else to this discussion?
So, in my research, Iran is, Iran in general stands as a kind of field for this collusion of different historical and social political forces. But discourse, how these forces justify themselves, was very important, because just like Turkey, just like how Cansu was explaining, Iran was more of a semi-colonial context. It was not really officially colonized. So you didn't have the same kind of power dynamics where you have a colonizer who has the upper hand. So the modernists, at least until the 1920s, I would say, had to prove their point, had to gain legitimacy. And in this Iranian modernist, or as some they call it, constitutional discourse, because it led to the 1906 constitutional revolution. Within this discourse, again, like Turkey's case, the past was pathologized. The past, that the country was ill, it had to be cured. The society was, dealing with death, and architecture, was framed in a similar way. So the architecture of the past was framed as an architecture of regression, backwardness, a dysfunctional past. But it was also the main culprit for epidemics, which were very common in 19th century Iran, like cholera especially, which had disrupted the political structure. And this architecture kind of prevented the emergence of a productive and a progressive nation. But what was the alternative? The alternative was an architecture of health, and that architecture of health was anything that could cut its ties with the architecture of the past. So basically, in a sense, modern architecture as an idea, I'm not talking about aesthetics or style, modern architecture was the healthy architecture. It was the inevitable solution to become healthy, a nation to become healthy. So all these discursive conflicts, all these debates resulted in very concrete outcomes as well. So to start with, in some older texts on house or on architecture in general, or on hammam, you see that there's this idea of pre-modern body, humoral medicine, a body which has to, establish a balance between its different organs. Whereas in modern texts, with the change in the medical perception, the building should be free of germs. So you have a body which moves from being in balance to being free of germs. So that's the healthy body. And this also has its effects in architecture as well. A very interesting example, I would say, especially after what John Su said, in the Iranian context, is hammam, because unlike Turkey, hammam was the main problem here in Iran. So it was, they had all these metaphors for hammam. They were, the central space which was criticized in constitutional writings and modernist writings. So there are metaphors such as factories of microbes or factories of disease. And, this was the main, because there was communal bathing, there was the kind of Shia practice of ghusl, or purifying the body, which needed, a big pool, and you had to be immersed in it. And this became really problematic, because modernists said, oh, these hammams are actually contributing to all these diseases and all these epidemics that are paralyzing our nation and are preventing us from becoming modern. But I think, since your question sort of addressed also about how these were negotiated, how these were dealt with, so the problem with hammams was not really simple. It was a very sensitive issue because it was religious as well. So the problem was the association of traditional bathing with the Shia notion of purifying. So the new hammams that were suggested by Iranian modernists or by the state, which were based on separate individualized shower cabins, all connected through corridors, they were not really accepted within the society. But at the same time, there was a religious kind of debate in play, because the modernists were saying, okay, purifying your body ghusl under a shower is equally valid. What's the reason? Why are you resisting? Sections of the society argued that no, this is not a proper ghusl. We should just do the traditional way of doing it, which was ghusl irtemasi. So kind of this battle between the two sort of eventually led to the emergence of a third kind, which had some elements from the old hammams, some elements from the kind of modernist hygienic envisioned and built hammams. But in this third type, which was like a synthesis of both, you had a big social space in the middle with stones to sit, stone benches to sit and receive massage. But you also have individual showers, all arranged around the central space. So in this way, they address the kind of hygienic concerns of modernists, but at the same time, they were preserving some of the elements of the older space. So I mean, I think this is quite an interesting case of how all these different discourses were in play, or how they were justifying new architecture, etc.
Thank you, Kamyar. So it's very interesting here that perfect hybrid of hammam and that douche bath combined together in an example. And what I think we are hearing across all cases is that the health and hygiene were actually never just about medicine, and they were always entangled with who gets to define what is modern and what is so-called backwards, and the negotiations between these two, the constant negotiation between them. So we will move with our second theme, emotions and sensory experience in institutional interiors. And in this theme, I am curious about these. How did patients in long-term healthcare facilities actually adapt imposed hygienic design rules to fit their own religious, cultural, and social structures? And how did Islamic notions of modesty, privacy, and ritual cleanliness shape the way patients experience these healthcare spaces? And how did they mediate emotions like fear, trust, and care? Kamyar, connecting your previous response to this question, would you like to take this one first?
Yeah, I think there were some very interesting, multisensory aspects in play, especially in these new regimes of hygienic architecture. And depending on the context and space, all these modern spaces could have different sensory implications. In the case of hammams, for example, or homes, houses, the modern domesticity, which was again a very hygienic version of how homes should be redesigned and rebuilt in Iran, which peaked in from 1920s onward. The goal was to avoid any kind of darkness, any kind of bad smells, or anything that's hidden. So no hidden corners. So you have all these modern ideals in place. So the space should have been bright, lots of openings, nothing hidden, everything very transparent, no smell that's suspicious, no odors. But one very important aspect, which I really like to explore a bit deeper, is the temporal perception. So how is time perceived in the new medicalized or new hygienic spaces as opposed to past? For example, when I talk about hammams, for example, modern hammams, modern hygienic hammams, and all those showers, the question of so what emerges is that it becomes important how long you stay in hammam. If you are staying for 1 hour, you have to pay this much. So a kind of precise time in a modern sense, which is very carefully calculated, becomes important. Because you also have the question of the water consumption, because unlike older hammams, where you could just go into a khazine, into a communal pool and stay for hours without being really worried about wasting water, in these modern showers, it was important. It was becoming more important how much you're wasting water or consuming water. And again, in old hammams, you could just go there from the morning until the evening, where with new hammams, that was just not possible, and that's also didn't really make sense in hygienic hammams. I'm not talking about the third kind of hammams, which became eventually prevalent. And at the same time, at homes, when you read the modernist texts, house economies of 1920s onwards, there's this emphasis on how the woman, who is the new ruler of the house in these texts, in this modern vision of the house, how she should carefully plan everything from dawn to dusk in order to run a very hygienic house, which is sometimes very much similar to a hospital. So you have a sick room, you have to constantly check your child if he or she is okay, if they don't need any more medicine, if they're healthy. And then you're constantly moving these different spaces, which are becoming very much subdivided. So in traditional houses, for example, you have a room which could be used for any kind of functions. You could sleep in them, you could eat in them. But whereas in modern houses, in these texts, people advise Iranians and Iranian women to have, a dining room, a bedroom, a reading room, and she constantly has to move between these rooms. Based on a very carefully planned timetable. So again, you're seeing a different idea of how space and time are connected, whereas in the older homes, you're basically in the same space or in very few spaces. You didn't have to move within the house or plan everything. But paradoxically, some of the spaces that emerged, as an outcome of these new modern kind of episteme or understanding, such as anti-addiction camps, which were very important in Iran because of the opium addiction, or tuberculosis sanatoria. In a sense, they did reject to some extent this idea of modern time. Again, because they were so isolated, they were completely cut off from the rhythms of modern urban life, which was emerging in Iran. So you had all these temporal perceptions of space, which were coexisting within these periods, to mid 20th century.
Thank you, Kamyar. You gave us several building typologies to think about. Cansu, how does this tension play in the Turkish sanatoria, or would you like to continue with any other building typology?
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating examples from Kamyar. There are so many similarities with the Turkish context. And I would love to continue with sanatoriums, of course. So together with our host, Deniz, we researched Turkish sanatorium examples, architecture, and in the Turkish sources, we again saw this very much this modernism narrative all over again. So I will take it from back here. What I mean is that in the accounts we looked at, mostly newspapers, magazines, how they were like promoted, and some published patient memoirs. The sanatorium is constantly presented as a place where an idealized modern life itself is being learned. There is the strong narrative that this is the European way of rehabilitation and recovery, and that the patients need to embrace this new lifestyle as a mindset, as a whole package in order to get better. So it is not only about medical treatments, it's also about adopting a whole set of habits and rest schedules, fresh air, sunlight, disciplined daily routines, even cultural practices. You literally see suggestions like listening to classical music in the sanatorium as part of its life. So this is where the temporal dimension becomes really interesting, and with the connection to what Kamyar said, because when you look at how daily life was structured in these institutions, it was extremely regulated with time schedules. The day was divided into very precise sequences: breakfast, sponge bath, rest hours, lunch, rest again, air cure, walk in the garden, and then medical consultation. Everything followed a strict schedule, and of course with plans, dietary menus, and etc. But at the same time, there was also a debate among Turkish physicians about whether sanatorium therapy actually required the sanatorium itself, the building itself. So, because there were never enough beds for the tuberculosis capacity, some doctors argued that if patients learn the discipline of the sanatorium life properly, how to plan your day accordingly, and they could replicate this therapy at home: fresh air, regulated routines, nutrition. But there were also opposing voices. And there is one very interesting, one physician, for example, I think it was Fahrettin Kerim Gökay, argued that this kind of highly regulated lifestyle could only be done in sanatorium buildings because it needs strict supervision, because it simply did not fit to Turkish society, because they had this Oriental mindset. Well, he used these words. I find it very interesting. It's not just again about medical developments, but like having a scheduled, regulated life, and how architectural space like enables it. So another thing I found very interesting about sanatoria and the tensions you mentioned about the nature of the institution more generally is there's a kind of duality. On the one hand, hygiene is about removing, disinfecting, erasing. So sanatoriums were designed to be easily cleaned and disinfected: white surfaces, minimal furniture, constant ventilation, hygienic architecture. But here a parenthesis with what modern hygienic architecture, but what I mean with modern hygiene, I don't mean that hygiene itself was a import from the Europe or West. Islamic societies had long-standing traditions of hygiene, bodily and environmental health, including concept of hıfzı sıha in Turkey. But what changed in this period I study is that authority to define hygiene, or the language or the knowledge used to define it anyways. So this duality in sanatorium buildings, on the other hand, while being hygienic, they were long-term care institutions, and patients often stayed there for months. And in that situation, people inevitably began to create a sense of domesticity, homeliness at least an attachment. So despite the strict architectural logic of hygiene and regulation, patients transformed their closed environments with small personal objects, radios, embroidery, flowers, photographs, even carving small notes on the furniture sometimes, as we are fascinated to see together with Dennis. And patients sometimes, and also medical staff, referred them as not as patients, but as guests. So there was like a hotel feel also with this sanatorium buildings, and this creates a tension between all these clinical medical requirements to keep this infection under control, all clinical sterile aspects, but on the other hand, it's a long-term place to stay, so there is a homeliness into it. So it creates a tension emotionally, and we always saw this in patients' memoirs, feeling so awkward in all this whiteness or all these chemical smells, but also recognizing a friend from their coughing, for instance. So they also get very sensitive to all the sensory stimulations, because staying in bed and spending so much time there makes you like aware of all these things. So it's a very interesting concept to see. Sanatoriums are great examples to observe these tensions.
I remember how affected we were when we were reading the diaries of the patients, so that was really sad and devastating. Knowing both of your work, Cansu's and Sarah's, there might be some similarities. So, Sarah, what can missionary records tell us about recovering patient experience, or would you like to add anything else to this answer?
I think if I can just bring it back a little bit, thinking about the patient's records, it was very interesting to hear that you had access to patients' diaries, which in my case, I couldn't really find anything. There were some newspaper articles in the National Library and Archive of Iran, but it was very difficult to find patient record. I would really also be interested to know if Kamyar managed to find any patient's records. So I had to really rely on the mission records themselves. And that's why I think the history of emotions and the senses can come in and help us to think about patients' experiences. For example, there were certainly different temporal worldviews, but how we are going to know how did actually patients experience these clashes? So this is something that I think the history of emotions and the senses can perhaps help us, and they can help us, for example, move on beyond the imposition or resistance binary, and also force us to not necessarily impose certain theories that were developed in the 20th century in the West to understand patients' experiences in the 19th century in a completely different context. Like mission records provide us with some clues about how people lived in the hospitals, and we can take these clues and situate them within their own histories. Patients, for example, could cook in the hospital, and they were allowed to cook, and that is very important to bear in mind, that they were allowed to cook in the hospitals. But we can, instead of taking this clue to turn it to a familiar story about what patients smell or what patients touched or felt, how we can think about the history of smell or the history of touch in the Islamic world or in the Persian world. Important to me that how we are going to approach recovering patients' experiences. Then we might come into the conclusion that to come back to Kamyar's point regarding temporal experience, that perhaps different temporal worldviews, they came into encountered one another. They even might had the capacity to transform one another, but that's to understand that we have to be really careful that how we are going to think about patients' experiences and how they actually smelled or touched, and how we are going to situate that within their own histories rather than imposing certain concepts or understanding to recover their experiences.
Thank you, Sarah. So on that note, we do not have many number of diaries. We have very few. And it was very difficult to access those as well. I mean, what I hear across all three cases is that it is very difficult to access the patient's voices, yet how clearly patients were not passive As Sarah also talked about cooking food in the healthcare institution, so I find it fascinating. And the patients found ways to negotiate these spaces through their own sensory and cultural worlds. On that note, I would like to share the next theme with you. Our third theme, which is on state performance using mass media and hospital visiting as tools. So let's unpack these questions. First, how mass media framed health and hygiene as expressions of authority in modernizing Islamic contexts. So, what political meanings did these representations produce? Second, how hospital visits by officials and journalists functioned as performative events, and what narratives of care and legitimacy were they trying to produce? Cansu, would you like to take this one first?
When we look at mass media in early Turkish Republic, which was actually my main research material for my doctoral dissertation, mostly magazines, popular newspapers. So this means going to a very different direction from recovering patient experience and like only looking at the representation. But this has other meanings. So we see that healthcare, hygiene, they became very much a public performance at the same time. And no big surprises, the state Turkish politicians and intellectuals and newspapers, they had although nuances in their language, but of course they had a very, in a way, coherent voice too. An ideology. I mean, so modernizing elites and medical experts. Through all these channels of mass media, they also public exhibitions. There was a staging of a spectacle of health in different ways. Of course, there was a pragmatic dimension to this. These media were also like meant to educate people about living healthy, disease prevention, and everyday practices. But at the same time, there was also a very strong symbolic and representative dimension, and all this was embedded in this nation building narrative. If you look, for example, at the coverage of hospitals and healthcare institutions, and especially their openings or groundbreaking ceremonies and officials' visits to medical institutions, these events themselves appear like almost staged. And when officials or journalists, for instance, visited a sanatorium or hospital, they followed a very particular script: carefully arranged wards, disciplined patients, resting on balconies, all happy. Of course, this couldn't be the reality of it. So there is a prescription of these narratives, at least, maybe not space itself strictly. So through these orchestrated officials' visits to hospitals, this like Turkish early Republican state appears almost as a benevolent healer, the compassionate hand bandaging the wounds of the Ottoman past. You see this narrative countless times. But this is in fact rather a continuity of Ottoman mentality, in the sense that healthcare service was also a generous gift to the subjects in the late Ottoman era too. So actually this is very much similar. Anyway, so these visits created a choreography, a compassion, control that invited citizens to internalize of this healthy life as a patriotic duty. And architecture plays a very central role in the spectacle, because it is used as communicating this abstract ideas in very tangible ways. Look at this modern building. So one striking example is the bacteriology laboratories. In many publications, it was represented almost like a temple of knowledge, ironically, and the laboratory was portrayed as the new sacred space of science, replacing older forms of authority. So photographs displaying this whiteness and order and equipment. But also there is this narrative of the microbe always like accompanying these narratives as the enemy, ultimate enemy, being fought at these sterile institutions. So microbe was a fascinating figure in the media of the time. Newspapers tried to teach the readers what microbes were, how they spread, how they could be eliminated, how they relate to the physical space. But at the same time, microbe also carried broader symbolic meaning. So when it is like a preventive health institution, this microbe idea, which was new for the public most of the time, it becomes a grand narrative of like, this is our new fight. Yeah, so And of course, always sunlight, fresh air are like both metaphorical and both like very tangible narratives you see throughout all these coverage.
Sarah, how does this compare with the missionary contexts, particularly around hospital visiting, or is there something else that you like to add?
Sure, thank you. Like, I think what I can add is that this public performance is also part of the missionary, and like how they are going to they are trying to portray themselves. And we are also have to consider that their magazines, they were published for a specific audience. So they wanted to say, see that this, like, we are successful, we are developing. So, and the purpose primarily was to raise money, basically, so they could continue their work. My main interest was not necessarily on governing representative who visited the hospitals, which was, of course, a really important thing to the missionaries, but they were also patients' family and friends. And they were the people who visited the hospitals regularly, and some of them even stayed in the hospitals. So it's kind of part of like patients' hospital, like visiting. And they had very different rules and regulations compared to hospitals that were built in Britain, where the patient's family and friends could only visit at specific times. Here, the story was completely different. Patients could stay in the hospitals. They were allowed to stay in the hospitals. Missionaries even like invented a new type of hospital planning where they were like a caravanserai, and there were specific like separated rooms, and patients could stay with their family and friends. They bring their entire belonging. So they're turning the hospital kind of to a house or to a home. And the narrative around their visiting is really important because they are saying that this is not ideal in terms of cleanliness and hygiene. So it wasn't something that they were happy with specifically, but they saw that this is necessary if we want to come into contact with as many people as possible. Thinking about public performance, and this also turned to a form of public performance, that they published photographs of patients with their family and friends, basically saying like, look, we have so many people in the hospital, we are so successful. But the story, of course, on the ground probably was very different. So we can never know completely.
Thank you, Sarah. I found that caravanserai hospital typology and with family living there, I find it very interesting. Kamyar, how did these dynamics of performance unfold in Iran, or would you like to add anything else to these discussions?
I mean, I was just thinking of adding two things to what Cansu and Sarah said. Well, firstly, in my case, going back to the sanatoria and patients' records, I couldn't access anything, just like Sarah, but they're like fiction and stories, popular stories, those which were published in the magazine, and sometimes they were set in sanatoria or spaces like that. They're very much dramatized, but sometimes you could get a sense of how these spaces were perceived. And the second thing I want to add is, a reflection to what Sarah said about how missionaries were building hospitals and designing them in a way that resembled Iranian houses to gain kind of trust. What is interesting is that I was writing something a few weeks ago, and I found this very short-lived hospital built in Iran, mid to late 19th century, by I think Austrian doctor, Dr. Polak, who lived in Iran at the time, and he did the same thing. So he wanted to build a modern hospital in Iran, but he built it in a way that resembled a house for the same reasons. But I think what is fascinating here is that Iranian modernists, on the other hand, when they wanted to build a hospital or anything, when they wanted to build a house, when they wanted to build a hammam, they wanted to turn everything into a modern hospital. Whereas Westerners or missionaries, when they wanted to build hospitals in Iran, they wanted to turn it to Iranian houses. So you have these kind of interesting contrasts, and maybe we should think about what are the reasons later. But anyway, to address this question, the third question, so mass media, just like what Cansu said, in Iran too, they had all these representations of medical being a hakim or a physician. who is curing someone, but everywhere is dark. The patient is lying on the floor, and then contrasting it to a modern hospital, which is, very shiny and white. But what I want to emphasize in the performative and representational aspects of modern medical spaces in Iran is that, to use a scholar's kind of core concept or formulation of from the late 19th century to maybe the mid 20th century, there was always this conflict between two major societal forces. So one was the modern middle class, as he puts it, and then the traditional middle class. So the modern middle class emerged in probably roughly around late 19th century, and and this is not about how poor they are or how wealthy they are. The class here is more defined by the cultural values or cultural capital. So the modern middle class, for them, modern science, modern medicine, hygiene, everything that kind of gives them privilege or a cultural capital was very important. On the other hand, for the traditional middle class, the traditional values were still important, like religion, like they were usually, many of them, they belong to bazaar sometimes, so their values were completely different. And there is always this clash between the two throughout the history, in the Iranian modern history. And mass media, especially magazines, newspapers, and modern education like schools, textbooks, they were usually tools in the hand of the modern middle class, which were heavily weaponized by them to use them against the traditional middle class, their values, and their associated spaces. So that's how it's kind of played a role. But another aspect is that the constitutional and modernist kind of literature, or rhetoric, or discourse in Iran, as scholars like Tawakkoli Taqi have argued and have shown, it was very much medicalized. So the Constitutional Revolution of 1906, for example, it was all centered around this medicalized discourse, using medical metaphors like facade, kind of being rotten. So there's this very heavily medicalized discourse. Or the country, as I said, was imagined as a sick mother which needed cure, and it was in urgent need of cure to rise up. So within this kind of medical political formulation, what emerges is that a good ruler should be like a good doctor. So he or she should be a proper doctor.
I think we lost the internet connection of Kamyar. He was saying that the authorities, the political authorities, for instance, governors, were like doctors, and we saw similarities of this in the Turkish case, for instance. Cansu, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, I can move on with my response. Making modern hospitals look like domestic spaces. I think this is like a fascinating starting point for thinking about like what nuance, what differences can we say about maybe Islamic contexts and modernizing healthcare institutions? Because I also know, for instance, Anne-Marie Adams's research that 19th century private healthcare institutions also used like this, looking the space look like a upper class residence for attracting the clientele. This was a strategy of promoting the new healthcare institution. But what happens when this is in a country that is at a phase that's like changing every cultural aspect of the people, which also includes what the houses, what is a residence, what is the ideal residence. So that definition was being changed. So you can't literally use this as a strategy of designing a new healthcare institution, make it look like residence. Okay, but what is the ideal residence? Because the traditional residence was being criticized. So I think this is a very interesting point to think about, this geographical contextual differences. And coming to Turkish contexts and housing and health relationship, housing became a very key arena where these ideas about health and modernization were translated into everyday life. And if you look at housing production in the early Republican periods, what we see is medicalization of domestic space of expert narratives. And again, coming to all these ventilation, sunlight, hygiene issues. And in my research, I keep coming across to this catchphrase as "Sıhhi ev," healthy house, hygienic house. And it became very important. It became a face of this campaign. modernization campaign. It was a catchphrase in appearing everywhere, exhibitions, newspapers. Of course, in the middle class discourse, as Kamyar said, it was so there was a low literacy rate, and it was in the newspapers, but it was also in the images, posters, exhibitions, radio conferences, people's houses, lectures, and etc. So this idea of ideal, healthy house, but it had some different meanings. In rural housing, hygienic house was closely connected to large-scale settlement programs after the population exchanges and migration from the Balkans to Turkey. After the population exchanges, so the state built many new village settlements, in fact, and in their promotion, you constantly see this narrative of healthy housing. And most of the time, it was the Ministry of Health in charge of making these construction projects. So in this process, the slogan of from thatch to tile, sazdan kiremite, appears in these campaigns, and it was always framed as a health issue. Mud brick, kerpiç was described as absorbing moisture, and timber, wooden material as harboring like insects, and traditional materials were increasingly pathologized in this official discourse. But of course, this was more than hygiene. It was also about being like a civilized, living in a civilized house. But the ultimate target was creating a very uniform landscape in a very multi-ethnic, multicultural Anatolian landscape. So it had an aesthetic target agenda, I can say. In urban contexts, however, one of the most interesting debates concerned the kafes, the latticed windows, also known as mashrabia in other regions in northern Africa. So these are wooden lattice windows in the traditional Islamic residences, very characteristic elements of the Islamic domestic architecture. They allowed women to observe the street while remaining visually protected, but they also provided sun shading and climate control. But in Republican discourse, these cafes, latticed windows was increasingly framed as some authors called an architectural veil and also a health hazard. So at the same time, veiling and charshaf was being discouraged or even banned by municipalities in public life. And sometimes it was in the same municipal decision that also the lattices will be dismantled from windows. But here it is complicated because the argument was they were health hazards for blocking the sunlight. In newspapers, and doctors argued that these lattice windows blocked sunlight, prevented ventilation, and they caused tuberculosis. And you see in anti-tuberculosis journals always this recommendation to remove the cafes from your windows. So which was a very characteristic Islamic feature of the traditional housing. So I think this is the most interesting, most maybe unique case in the Turkish context in the 1930s. And there was a second argument. If it was not just health, because it also believed that deprived of sunlight, so this caused a laziness and a kind of like oriental lethargy, which is not something we want within this was the narrative within these times of building the country and etc. But this anti-orientalist discourse was not necessarily rejecting the idea of a backward orient. Through examining the cafes, we can see that instead many Turkish intellectuals argued that Turkey was now moving to the other side of the binary. The binary still existed, and cafes was a symbol of this movement, and it was tied to tuberculosis. I think this is a very interesting example, and it also relates to aesthetics because it's the facade of the house. So removing it meant having like, I don't know, more open windows and more simple facades and everything. So it is a very complicated case linked to cultural changes, health and architecture, and you always see this as a triad in this middle class narratives in popular media.
From what you said, I am wondering about how new housing production in Islamic cities took up modernization discourses around health space, and whether epidemics actually drove the shift away from traditional construction methods, or if that narrative oversimplifies what happened. and then how medical knowledge worked its way into existing Islamic domestic spheres and reshaped everyday life and bodily practices. Maybe we can continue our discussions on housing with Kamyar.
So there are lots of parallels with what Cansu said. For example, all the emphasis on simplicity, a house free of germs. But again, about the skin and how it's related to the problem of kind of a veil. So there are certain things which I want to point to. For example, until the 1940s, there were like very few beds. So they weren't really answering to the needs of the Iranian society in terms of being cured and having enough hospital beds. The houses somehow became or were kind of encouraged to become like domestic hospitals, with the woman, again, with the woman, the housewife, ruling over the house like a doctor, like a medic. She also had to provide a safe space, which is also healthy for the sons of the nation who are in the future going to build a kind of progressive country, and also provide a nice homely shelter for the husband who was working outside and was coming back from the harsh world of the city. But just like what Cansu mentioned about, qafas or mashrabiya, in the Iranian case, there were similar but not exactly the same arguments about house and skin. For example, the writings by doctors in magazines of the time, which say, oh, like our skins, we need to put on less layers because it's good to be exposed to the sun and to the fresh air. And they say, like, they have the same arguments about houses, how they should be free of ornaments. They should stop imitating the architecture of the past. For example, Vartan, who was, a prominent modernist Iranian architect in the 1940s and 50s, he writes, on two occasions, he establishes this parallel. So in one of them, he says, his words, sorry, but he says we need to build houses which have simple facades instead of making buildings that have all these ornaments on them, like old women who want to use makeup to make themselves look young. It is the same. It's just we shouldn't do that. Or he says we need to open up the house, just like how the state is trying to unveil women. So to make or to build more balconies, or opening up the house, or making the house more transparent, more connected to the public space, was paralleled with women taking off their hijab, their veil, or the unveiling, which was supported by the state. But in practice, layouts emerged, which were a combination of, like flexible domestic spaces of the past, but, with a kind of more hygienic and more easier kind of gender codes. We didn't have the same kind of layout that we had as past, but some elements of it survived. In terms of construction, especially, this was important because the ideal material for all these hygienic ideals of building a house were materials like cements, like concrete, but these were not easily available at the time in 1940s, 50s. So they used some traditional techniques, or some older masons, more traditional mason builders, they followed these this kind of modern aesthetics, but they used traditional materials, which were not ideal for a hygienic house. There was this kind of synthesis, these hygienic visions, which were operated through certain traditional techniques and practices.
Sarah, would you like to add anything from your own perspective to housing discussions?
I will try to keep it short. I just want to go back to what Cansu said. Sorry, I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. About the meaning of home changing. And I found that very interesting. Made me think about very specific in terms of the missionaries, because in many cases they build the hospitals in locations that's the modernizing state or the colonial power really, they didn't really build a hospital, so they were operating like somehow on the margin in certain locations. Like, I think that kind of relates to like the meaning of home was changing perhaps in certain locations and not in any, like everywhere. They wanted to come into contact with certain group of people that maybe the colonial state wasn't able to come into contact with those people. And they were like, missionaries really the first time that people came into contact with what we may call like Western biomedical medicine. So that's also, I think, why they had to be perhaps strategic about why they need to operate in a certain way. And if I come back to the question of housing, so they started their hospitals in many cases in a rented building, in a rented house. And I think that was also a way for them to learn about how the buildings are constructed and how people really live in certain environments or in certain spaces, so they could copy that kind of architecture in their hospitals to a certain extent. Also, we have to be careful, like the missionaries really wouldn't understand what it's like, what is a house, a traditional kind of Persian or Iranian house, what they were building or what they were trying to copy wasn't necessary an architecture of home. It was their understanding of the architecture of home. And in that case, one hospital that I look at in Kerman, it is not like, and that one was built in the 1914. So it is not completely using decorations, but still we can see that they are using traditional house or home architecture when they are thinking about the planning, sometimes the planning of a house, how the people approach the building, and also like in terms of the facades to some extent, also about the ceiling, about the arc, or about all of this very small detail. They are using the traditional like architecture in a way, or the architecture that is really local to the region, and people would kind of have a connection with, perhaps, if that makes sense.
Yes, Sarah, thank you very much. It makes perfect sense. And I find it very interesting when they are settling in the existing houses, and then when they are building new hospitals, they are copying those houses as well in the special layout. So this is very interesting. So to maybe lure people in. And we have similar cases in Turkish sanatoria. Maybe Cansu can talk about it. For instance, they first settle in köşks or kiosks, the residential houses from the Ottoman period, and then around that köşk and its surroundings, the sanatoria often expand. Cansu, would you like to add anything to this discussion or anything else on the housing?
Yes, I think it's very interesting that almost all the sanatorium examples that we studied with you, they start with in Ottoman mansions, and most of the time the administration is not so proud of that building. Like they want to, as soon as possible, visually make it very contrasting to the new buildings, that they don't look like that anymore. So they don't want that domestic space being so visibly, I think, recognizable in a way. They create that domesticity in how it functions, maybe not how it looks. Yeah, so I found it very interesting. And also in this Heybeliada Sanatorium example, this expansion, I want to go like 2 steps back to this microbe knowledge, because especially when the sanatorium started expanding from that kiosk to the health complex, it was on an island. The locals of the island started a petition against it because this architectural expansion felt for them the expansion of the disease. I think disease invading the island in a way, maybe. So this is maybe also something to think about in residential areas when there are new healthcare institutions, how they responded, how they took it. Overall, it's a good thing to have this modern institutions, but when it's in the neighborhood that you actually live every day, and it is like a confined area, like an island. So there was also these tensions of micro panics, and they perceived it through like their living environments and very close to an infectious disease institution. This is also another way to think about all this.
So I would like to share our next theme with you. That is on gender and how it shapes spatial arrangements, perhaps with particular attention to women's roles in health and healthcare in Islamic societies. And here I am keen to understand first how gendered spatial arrangements in Islamic urban spaces, public buildings, and healthcare institutions reflected social norms while also reconfiguring moral authority around health and care, and how these arrangements were legitimized within modernization discourses. Second, what roles women actually played as patients, nurses, caregivers, doctors, or other roles or other professions in mediating the modernization of healthcare spaces and practices in Islamic contexts. Sarah, would you like to proceed with this one?
I want to just go back about that they try to copy the architecture of home, and that's where like in terms of gender or gender like spatial arrangement, that's somewhere that we can see this. They divided, for example, the hospitals to a section for men, a section for women, and in terms of the women hospital, how the patients were going to they designed the entrance or how the patients were going to approach the hospital or enter the hospital. They designed it in a way to ensure privacy or how missionaries understood people's understanding of privacy. That is where it is very visible in a way. And one case is particularly, and I found that hospital really fascinating because they called it a Parde hospital. And coming back to Chanzu and Kamyar's point regarding whaling, and they are not really they're not really condemning it or want to get rid of it, like the question of whaling or particularly find it problematic in any way. And they designed these hospitals completely for women, and it had an outer entrance and an inner entrance, and the outer entrance was both for male and female, for everyone. But they built the caravanserai out of the hospital for male relatives of the patients because they thought the female patients are not going to stay in the hospital if their male relatives are also not with them. And then the inner gate would lead to the hospital, which was reserved completely for female patients. But that also meant that they had access to the male relatives and probably could cook for them or care for them. Probably that was also part of the story. It is like, as I mentioned before, it wasn't necessary that they thought this is ideal, but they also didn't really care that patients want to do this. It was really a strategy to that they thought then to come into contact with people, and then they thought about it in terms of architecture and how it might look like in terms of architecture and how we might bring people into the building. And that also meant they could also come into contact with male relatives and perhaps go outside the female state, like the female hospital, and perhaps preach to the male patients as well, which was part of what they wanted to do.
Thank you, Sarah. So, sick women in hospital are still going out to the outer complex to care for their families and for men. So, why not surprised here? So, okay, maybe Cansu, let's move on with you. How were these gendered special logics articulated in Turkish healthcare institutions, or would you like to add any other building typologies?
Thank you. I can also, talk about both healthcare institutions and also come back to housing a little bit. I mean, this issue of veiling and visibility is a very interesting discussion. As Sarah mentioned, it's also a fascinating example. And I think this also connects to my earlier discussion about lattice windows, like intervening with this privacy of women within the house based on health arguments. But on the one hand, the official discourse was encouraging houses to be open visually toward the outside to get more sunlight and fresh air and more visibility for women. But when you look more closely at the architecture itself, it's sometimes complicated because for instance, there's Esra Akçan's study of this modernist Atadan Villa, a modernist house designed for a woman. But if you look at it closely, it is completely modernist in terms of all this avant-garde European modernism. But at the same time, if you look at the circulation routes, the spatial organization, you can see that there is still traces of that gendered circulation within the house. Certain routes within the house were designed specifically for the female owner, allowing movement through space without encountering male visitors, if I'm not wrong. about that example. So within modernist architecture, you can still trace gender segregation. It was preserved in Turkish context in residences, and also we can connect to healthcare institutions here in sanatoriums. So gender separation was present from the very beginning. At first, in Heybeliada sanatorium, for instance, it was just separate rooms, then separate floors. As the institution expanded, separate wards, separate pavilions, then separate blocks, men and women. So doctors usually justified this separation through medical reasoning for the nature of the treatment and long-term nature of the stay. And it was true that it was not just Turkey. Internationally, especially public state sanatoria separated the sexes. So they often argued that separating men and women was beneficial both morally and psychologically for patients ongoing this delicate long-term treatment. But when we studied the Heybeliada Sanatorium, we found very particularly interesting architectural solutions that dealt with the separation issue. The first example is the collapse therapy unit. There was only one such unit in the first building, but it had to serve both male and female patients. The way they designed the space, it had separate entrances, separate dressing rooms, separate waiting areas for men and women. But the central treatment room at the center itself was shared, but patients entered and exited through different circulation paths, and so that women and men never actually encountered each other. So it's, in a way, this arrangement like strongly resembles spatial strategies we see in Islamic Ottoman traditional domestic architecture, where shared spaces could exist, but women often had like separate circulation routes and private spaces that allowed them to move without contact with male guests. And there was another similar logic, the large auditorium. It was a shared space used for lectures, films, and social events. Men and women patients used it simultaneously, but again, through carefully designed spatial separation, they had different entrances, and women sat on the balcony while men occupied the ground floor of the auditorium, and they entered through different doors and different floors. They came from different blocks. And also this balcony arrangement in a way resembles the organization of the mosques actually. So this is very like interesting to see in a modern healthcare facility. There is some architectural knowledge coming from Islamic traditions. And about like women's role in all this health narrative, yes, in this modernization narrative, they were the professional, they were the faces of care in the popular media. And women were often photographed in laboratories looking through microscopes. This image was very symbolic, and they appeared as guardians who could detect and prevent disease within the house, similar to what Kamyar described. But at the same time, while being care professionals, public health campaigns were also like directed very strongly toward women as mothers and housewives. Advice literature, girls' institutes, and products advertisements and exhibitions all framed women as guardians of health within the house first. Then comes the professional identity. So the scientific housewifery was framed as a profession in a way, like a medical profession. There was a very scientific language targeting housewife work, but at the same time, always it had an emotional message, like scaring them with like, if you don't do this, your child will die, and it's bad for the nation. And sorry, I simplified it too much, but this medical narrative targeting the woman within this healthcare modernization most of the time also came with a very emotional context because of the stereotypical belief that women understood that language. So I think this is also very interesting tension about women's role in this medical modernization.
I also find it a real paradox. So modernization put women forward as symbols of progress, but at the same time kept redefining what they were supposed to be and what roles they were supposed to play. And architecture actually made that tension quite visible. Kamyar, being familiar with your work, you might bring in a perhaps unexpected space to these discussions. Would you like to continue?
Question, I was thinking of like having a distance from medical spaces, but thinking about other spaces that emerge within modernity in Iran and in the region. So, for example, I'm thinking of performative arts and the spaces associated with them and how they're related to all these medicalized concepts of modernization. So, for example, in the context of Iran, and I'm sure it resonates with other countries in the region as well, there were music was played in certain spaces and certain settings called majlis, which was, usually domestic, nocturnal gathering, people lying down, so bodies were quite relaxed. They were not seated on a chair like a concert venue. They drank, they smoked opium quite frequently in these spaces. And then there are also musicians sitting on the floor playing, and in quite a flexible manner. And on the other hand, we have like performative traditions, theatrical traditions like Taziya, which is a religious theater tradition in Iran, very Shia concept. And, but it is still basically theater. And all the roles are usually played by men. So even if you have women, they're played by either children or small little boys, trying to be, pretending that they're women, and everybody accepts it because within that tradition, it's just like this. It's not against any mental contract of the viewers. But when all these new spaces emerge, for example, theaters or concert venues like Grand Hotel in Tehran, famous example, they shifted to perform modern plays, or modern as in Western and modern in general. So, for example, I don't know, plays which were romantic, which were not religious, and they had to have lovers which were female in the script, or they played music while the audience were sitting on the chair. And these spaces made it visible that how the old body, the pre-modern body, the Iranian pre-modern body is actually very much problematized. There's this Afsan Najmawadi who argues that gender dynamics in Iran, when modernization entered the society, it tended to shift the society from a homosexual kind of tendency to a heterosexual and heterosocial norms. And you can sort of see this in these spaces where there were critiques. Iranian modernists wrote about performances in these new modern places and saying that, these are the same opium-addicted, lethargic, ill, corrupt bodies. Why are we using boy actors instead of women? This is just corrupt. This is not good. You don't see this. And whereas they weren't writing about this in traditional spaces, in majlis, or what made it visible for them was the emergence of these performative modern spaces, like the concept of a concert or a public theater. So this is what I was really interested about how these other supposedly non-medicalized or non-medical spaces reveal or put in tension or confuse all these subjectivities about how a healthy body should be, or how a progressive, hygienic, healthy space or nation should be reformulated within a different context, which in this case is performative arts.
Thank you, Kamiar. This certainly brings in an unexpected typology to the discussion. On that note, we can move on with our final theme, that is COVID-19. Perhaps a bit of a cliche nowadays, but I think we can make it interesting by connecting it to culturally responsive design in Islamic contexts and societies. And I am curious about continuities and ruptures. So what does the COVID-19 pandemic reveal about the longer history of negotiating between modern medicine and Islamic practices, and which elements of Islamic built environment traditions proved beneficial during the pandemic, or might have been if they had been preserved? Then, perhaps looking forward, what contemporary healthcare projects bridge Islamic tradition and modern practice, and what lessons do they offer for future Islamic healthcare design in terms of cultural continuity, local knowledge, and climate response? So, Kamiar, connecting from your previous response, would you like to take this one up as well?
I'm more interested in ruptures and how COVID especially disrupted normal and established relations between bodies and space. For example, to start with, we have had all these isolated sites of cure, like sanatoria in early 20th century to mid 20th century, or anti-addiction camps. But they created this kind of micro cosmos, which follow different rules. I think COVID produced something similar, but within the context of contemporary Iran, post-Islamic revolution Iran. So, for example, there are very strict gendered codes on dancing and music and how women should be dressed. But when COVID happened, I give you an example to see how it can kind of suspend all these rules. You can still find it if you Google it. So there are multiple Iranian doctors and nurses, male and female, in mixed settings, in state hospitals. So very much official. They were run by the government. So they were very strict, theoretically. So they were dancing with, forbidden Los Angeles, diaspora Iranian music in these hospitals during the times of COVID. And these videos were, it's quite a surreal, kind of grotesque image, seeing people in all these very medical, heavily, gowns and, all these medical dresses, but they're dancing to this music in a very white space of this artificial light, white space of the hospital. These videos were widely circulated, but not only they didn't face any consequences, because in normal situation they would face consequences for publishing something like that, but also they were encouraged by the government, or they were sort of propagated because the government was facing a lot, and the state was facing a lot of criticism about how they were dealing with COVID. So this was a way of, at the same time, this was a way of giving hope to the to the society and saying, look, we have all these nurses and medics and doctors who are very happily and bravely fighting against COVID. So a very compelling depiction of this moment in Iranian cities appears in a documentary called "The Silent City," Shahr Khamush. Well, Khamush in Persian can mean both off, the city that is turned off, and silent. And it portrays like a series of silence episodes of Tehran, the city, the capital, which is always very noisy and bustling and very lively. It has a nightlife. And in this film, as you can see, and I've written about it with another scholar, Tehran is radically in contrast with what it always is. So it's clean rather than polluted. It's silent rather than noisy. It is deserted rather than crowded. And it has all these lonely nights instead of, its famous, thriving, youthful nights. And another parallel is that a few months after, COVID restrictions were lifted, there was a social uprising in Iran, which was very much centered on the relation, women movement, which was very much about the relation between bodies, the public space, and the, codes of conduct in the public space. So I think there are all these kinds of, interesting suspensions of, during times of epidemics and pandemics, which can have very social political impacts, because especially contagious diseases like endemics, like COVID, like pandemic, epidemics, they're essentially and necessarily political and social diseases, because we're talking about the relation between bodies, not just an isolated body. We are talking about the relation between bodies, and what we have between bodies is space. So I think necessarily it would have an impact on all these aspects.
Thank you, Kamyar. And perhaps we can continue with Cansu. Cansu, do you see similarities? And in addition, what continuities and differences do you see between perhaps tuberculosis and COVID, or would you like to add anything else?
Yes, thank you. Well, I was fascinated to hear the connections Kamyar made. Very interesting approach to this question, but I was thinking this issue more in the context of the perspective of materials and everyday spatial experience. So, like many people written about like how COVID forced us to rethink certain architectural assumptions we earlier had, like ideas like the open plan in modern architecture, or like highly shared interior spaces. Suddenly things like open offices, shared living rooms, dense apartments, buildings felt so risky. And what I find interesting is something very similar happened historically, like during this tuberculosis, because before the 1960s, maybe 50s, there was no definite cure to tuberculosis, like no drug therapy. So prevention was essential. So people learned about this. People had to reinterpret their everyday environments through this new knowledge of invisible microbes that could be anywhere. So it should definitely have altered the way people thought about their physical surroundings and architecture. So how like diseases make people rethink their architectural space is a very relevant question all the time. So we saw something similar during COVID at the beginning of the pandemic. There was a lot of anxiety about these surfaces and materials, especially porous ones. Like people were worried about like touching the door handles, furniture, packages being like left in the balconies, and balcony became a luxury item. And so only gradually did the focus shift towards like droplets and airflow and personal distance. But the initial phase of this uncertainty generated of this new awareness of this new virus and how physical space might contribute to transmit of disease, this is very similar because COVID and tuberculosis, airborne diseases, but of course, COVID transmits way faster than tuberculosis. This is also connects to like questions of architectural tradition. If we look at elements like in Islamic built environments, some of them actually proved quite adaptable situations like this, like courthouses, for example, with their inward orientation and natural ventilation, came to be the ideal again. And also maybe about environmental and climate conditions, because these traditional building materials like mud brick and reed thatch, as I said, they also started being reconsidered as environmentally sensitive, more healthy, less chemical surroundings, and also sustainable solutions. This is also like a broader question that we can learn from Islamic traditional residential architecture. And also, yeah, about the healthcare institutions, I don't have a good example, unfortunately, but considering one now, the dominant type in Turkey, new type in Turkey is this şehir hastaneleri, city hospitals, if we could translate it like that. These enormous healthcare complexes that resemble huge shopping malls with huge interiors and huge scale. So yeah, after COVID, haven't we learned like anything about ventilation? I don't know. This is an interesting point concern. But yeah, now after COVID, now this climate urgency also brings together like the building traditions, the modernization program I mentioned almost erased the sustainable building materials. Modernization deleted them almost, and for the health argument, ironically. This is the huge irony that we must consider now. Yeah, and this is I focused on tuberculosis all the time, which is an airborne disease. I can just drop the question, like we might also think about water. What happens when we think about return of cholera? Because I remember it didn't actually return maybe in Turkey, but after the huge earthquake in a couple of years ago, in all these torn regions, there was a really like literally scare about is like can this cause cholera outbreaks? And I know water infrastructure is a problem in many war-torn regions in the Syria or Gaza. So air is one thing to think about it, water is another, and we will never never be out of humanitarian crises in Islamic regions that will make us reconsider this architectural ideas linking to health of the individual, both physically and mentally, maybe.
Thank you, Cansu. So yeah, there were cholera outbreaks in southeastern Anatolia as well after the earthquake.
Yeah.
There were attempts to prevent these outbreaks. In terms of traditional houses, I always thought that taşlık space, if we can translate it as stone-paved inner hall, a very functional space, and I wish I had that space during the pandemic. It's stone-paved, and around it there are services spaces in traditional houses in Turkey. And so that space can be washed through and through. So then it goes to the upper floors with the stairs. Then there's the sofa space and the living quarters. But when you go first directly into the house, there is that taşlık space, and then you can wash it. You can wash everything there. Sarah, maybe you can close us out with an example that points towards future possibilities, or would you like to add anything else to these discussions?
Sure, thank you. I would like to share an example. I think that it, especially from my current research, and that's the Aachen University Hospital in Karachi. Perhaps some people already know it. Whether it is a successful example, I'm not sure. It depends how we define, probably depends on how we define Islamic tradition. But I think it is an important case because it started a new, it wanted at least to start a new conversation about architecture and about hospital architecture in the Islamic world, or about architecture in what they call the spirit of Islam. I think historians of hospital design who are not necessarily as familiar with Islamic traditions may argue that this hospital resemble the low-rise hospitals that were constructed in the second half of the 20th century across the world. But I would urge them to look a little bit deeper. And I don't mean that's just about this hospital, but when I was looking at the National Library and Archive of Iran, and also at the Sindh Archive in Karachi, and I'm sure it's the same in Turkey, I found like records of more than like 100, 200 hospitals. And I kind of think if we say that there has been no innovations whatsoever in any other part of the world, we are kind of erasing a large amount of knowledge about hospital design. And that is what is important to me. I'm not saying that they can be necessarily used as an example for the future, but maybe we can use them to start a conversation about hospital design, perhaps in the Islamic world. And something I would like to I was reading recently a book about global history of science called Horizons, and it has like, maybe you know the book, and it's what it's trying to say is that science was not invented in the West, and it does that really beautifully and very convincingly, and made me think, can we kind of write a history of modern healthcare architecture or modern hospital design that starts not in the West, that actually starts in any other parts of the world? I just wanted to finish with that.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a very nice ending to our discussion. And this is why you guys are here, actually. So 3 brilliant panelists are here to do that. I think what COVID-19 reminded us, and that this entire conversation has shown, is that these negotiations between modern medicine and local traditions are never really over. And the questions that we have been discussing so far historically are pretty much alive today. So before finishing, I would like to share this last slide with our audience for our correspondence information. So please do not hesitate to contact us should you have any questions about today's delightful discussions. And thank you all for your time and engagement today. And I would like to thank our 3 brilliant panelists, and it has been a delightful experience organizing this event with you. And I would also like to thank the IJIA team for their support in the preparation of this event. And I hope our discussion has offered valuable perspectives on how healthcare environments are never purely functional. They're always sites of cultural translation, human agency, and architectural adaptation. I would like to close this roundtable with a lighter remark. As we celebrate the International Women's Day tomorrow, I would like to honor all the women around the world who continue to make the world a better place each and every day. Please look for our conversation on YouTube in the following days, weeks, and watch for the upcoming issue of IJIA in 2027.